uses mixed methods to examine potential win-win outcomes for people and the environment. He researches links among population, health, livelihoods, and the environment for equitable, sustainable development and conservation solutions through projects in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and California. Lopez-Carr is a Kavli Frontiers of Science Fellow, a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and recipient of the Outstanding Population Research Award of the Association of American Geographers. He has authored with colleagues and with more than 50 student advisees, over 170 publications, thanks to funding from over 50 fellowships, grants, and awards from NASA, NSF, NIH, NOAA, and the UN, and the Mellon Fulbright Foundations, and numerous other sources. Professor Lopez-Carr is active in gender and ethnic diversity services and is former chair of the UC Faculty Senate Committee on Affirmative Action, Diversity, and Equity. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for the introduction. Should I share my screen and start the PowerPoints?
Sure.
All right. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yeah.
We can see the entire, I don't know if you want to show like the PowerPoint presentation or the entire like PowerPoint screen with all your upcoming slides. That's what we see.
Oh, do you just see that? You don't just see the screen?
No, we see, there we go. Now we do.
Oh, okay, perfect. There's a little delay there, it looks like, a little lag. Okay, well, thank you all for inviting me, and I'm really pleased to be here before you to just present some of my research around the themes of population health and environment dynamics, including climate dynamics. And I'm just going to present some evidence over the last several years from various research projects I've been involved in across the world, mostly the developing world. So I want to emphasize that research on human environment dynamics has traditionally most often focused on socioeconomic drivers. And there is relatively little literature on population and health dynamics in relation to the environment. And now is really a unique time to study population and health. Just a few years ago, we surpassed 50% urban and rural globally. And so at this time on the planet, we are going through every different transition of the demographic transition that has existed historically, from the earliest stages of high mortality and high fertility in places like sub-Saharan Africa to post-transition places like South Korea, Italy, where we have below replacement fertility rates and very low mortality. So we have all of these transitions that took the developed world hundreds of years to transition through. They're all unfolding across the globe as we speak right now. And if trends go forward as demographers expect, this will not be the case in 20, 30 years from now, where we should all expect to be living in a more urban environment with a rather finished demographic transition. That's the expectation, at least. So until that happens, this is a very dynamic time to be studying population and its related health interactions with the environment. So the first issue I want to discuss is how the environment is related to fertility. So specifically, how does resource access, for example, land, impact fertility? And there's very little literature on this, but there was some studies that were done in the 60s and 70s that suggested that with access to more land, fertility increases. And in fact, historically, we see this in the United States with the Great Westward Expansion during the 1800s, where the open lands that are provided to frontier colonists seem to be associated with higher fertility as well. Made sense for both supply and demand reasons. We needed children to work on the farm, and also with more children, there's more mouths to feed. So for these reasons, there have been hypotheses that land access is related to higher fertility. And so we did some research on land, largely on land use and land cover change in the Ecuadorian Amazon. It's the most biodiverse place on the planet because it's on the slopes of the Andean mountains. So it's very close to the Andean foothills. And I don't know if any of you have been to Ecuador, but if you're in Ecuador, it's just astonishing geographically and culturally and ethnically. If you're on the equator in the middle of the country, you'd be on top of Mount Cayambe, or for example, and it's the highest volcano in the world at over 20,000 feet, perennially snow-capped, again, on the equator. And from it, you can see down into the forests, into the Pacific tropical coast, and into the Amazon, looking out towards the east. And so because of this incredible diversity ecologically, you basically have everything from what we'd expect in terms of latitude, everything from the North or South Pole almost all the way to the equator, all in one area. Because of the great elevation, we have really what is the most biodiverse rainforest on the planet here, and also in portions of Peru. And this is a very dynamic place. So it was recently colonized in the 70s and 80s. By the 90s, we see the development of some frontier cities such as Lago Agrio. And as these frontier urban areas develop, the total fertility rate plummets from 7 or 8 to 3.5 very quickly. Whereas in indigenous communities, literally right across the river from Lago Agrio, we have fertility rates that are still well above 7 births per woman. So the TFR fell from close to 7 to nearly 4 in the larger region during the 1990s. Why such a quick transition in fertility? So in the late 60s, there was oil discovery, and very similar to what we see in other frontiers in Latin America. With this, we have road and pipeline construction, and then you have spontaneous settlement of migrants coming from other areas of the country, in this case, the more population density, dense highlands, to fill these areas looking for land. And with that, we have rapid development of frontier towns, markets, roads, and services. And with that, rapid deforestation of what, again, is this most biodiverse place on the planet. Initially for subsistence crops, and then eventually there's land consolidation, and there's the production of palm oil, for example, coffee, as well as larger cattle plantations. And this is our study area. So we did a survey of several hundred colonist farmers in 2 time periods in the 1990s, and controlling for demographic and socioeconomic factors. If you go down to the bottom and you see in red, we did see that the increase in land change between the 2 time periods of our surveys was related to higher fertility. And greater assets was associated, as we would expect, with lower fertility. Distance to market was associated with, so longer distance, more remote area, higher fertility. So really all of this does converge to tell the story of these more remote areas where their largest subsistence agriculture, and the economy is very then based on the household, very much based on the household. The more land available, the higher the fertility. And in similar research I did in Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula, in a biosphere reserve known as the Ciencan Biosphere Reserve, I found that increased access to fishing rights, to fishing areas, was also related to higher fertility. And I have a paper on that in Population Environment if anyone wants to see it as well. Okay, so how about fertility environment? How does fertility impact land use? The other way around. So we just talked about how the environment can modify fertility potentially. How about the other direction? How does fertility potentially impact land use and forest cover change? So this is work I've been doing since the 1990s in Guatemala, project on population, migration, livelihoods, and land change in the Maya Biosphere Reserve. Specifically, my survey of several hundred farm households is done in the Sierra de la Candon National Park here in red, which is a core conservation zone of the Maya Biosphere Reserve. And up until the late 1980s, nobody lived here. But similar to what we observed in the Ecuadorian Amazon, as we just discussed, and similar to what we observe in the Brazilian Amazon, in the 70s and 80s particularly, there was oil discovery here close to Mexico. And then oil interests came and built roads, initially just very rudimentary dirt roads for the oil equipment to go through. But with that, then we had a rapid influx of migrants from throughout Guatemala. And each little pixel here represents one household clearing land almost entirely for subsistence corn, with some other crops such as beans and squash as well, but nearly entirely based on corn. However, each of these little blotches representing one household pales in comparison to this massive blotch in the southeast of the park, which also represents one household. What is that household doing to the land? If all these other ones are growing corn, what do you think this one household is doing in terms of their land use? Any thoughts? So this one household is a cattle ranch. So it really does put into relief for you the importance of how land is used in terms of looking at connections between socioeconomic and demographic drivers of land use, land cover change. To the extent that people are using the low labor intense pasture holdings, then the deforestation can be orders of magnitude greater per household than if they're growing subsistence crops. And with that globally, we do have this massive footprint on the Earth's surface because of meat production and meat consumption. So I could go through all the fancy models that we ran, showing all the socioeconomic, political drivers of deforestation, but since this is a medical school, let's focus on demographic factors. So controlling for socioeconomic, political, institutional, and geographic factors, we did find that larger communities was related to more agricultural expansion. The fertility rate during the 90s was 8 births per woman approximately, and larger households did have more agricultural expansion. And so this corroborated work that we also did in the Ecuadorian Amazon. So doing this work where I just showed you the demographic component, but the most important predictor of deforestation was actually land availability, similar to the biggest predictor for fertility in the Ecuadorian study. Now, running our multi-level models, we could come up with an R-squared of around 0.65. So we could explain about 2/3 of the deforestation at the household level in the Sierra de Lacandon National Park. But since nobody lived here until the mid 80s to late 80s, there's 100% correlation between migration to this forest frontier and deforestation. So that begs the question of why people are here and where they came from, and what were the drivers that led to people migrating here, as opposed to not migrating at all, or as opposed to migrating elsewhere. So this asks the question then, how does internal migration impact the environment? So surely processes in distant places such as skewed land distribution, demographic pressures, poverty, civil war that lasted until 1997 led to land use, land cover change in other places in Guatemala. Because of the protracted civil war here that ended in the late 90s, over 1 million people were displaced in Guatemala. And it was probably the largest migration event in recent history in the Americas. And we have, Guatemala being the size of Ohio with a similar population as Ohio, but Ohio, which is over 80% urban, compares to Guatemala, which is only about 60% urban. And Guatemala has 40% of those people living in rural areas that depend directly on the land. And despite that, 2% of landowners own 2/3 of all the land in Guatemala. So you can imagine with this, the massive population pressures that exist, the demand for land and the lack of land accessibility for the 40% of the population that are rural subsistence farmers. So these are kind of the common denominator issues that led to migration to the Lacandon. However, I must stress here, why did they move there? Why would you move your family to a rat and mosquito infested place with no schools and no healthcare, essentially no government presence? It's a frontier area controlled in many places by narco interests. It's very dangerous. Why would you make that move? And in many cases, it's because people are desperate. It's really their last option. They need land, and they can't find land where there are already people, where places are already settled, and where the wealthiest tend to have already consolidated the land. They find land where it's available, which is in remote tropical forest frontiers, which are increasingly located in and around only in protected areas. So there were demographic factors that led to higher migration precisely to the forest frontiers opposed to other places. Families with larger households were more likely to move to a frontier environment than to remain or to move to an urban environment. There were socioeconomic factors. People with higher education were more likely to remain or to move to an urban environment or even to the US. There were political economic factors, where those with less land availability were more likely to move to a frontier environment. And I think this slide is very reflective of the local situation. This is the Pacific Coast, where Pepsi and Coca-Cola and other multinationals own large swaths of sugarcane. And here it says, pide más, ask for another Pepsi. And this sign says, no parking here. So essentially, this is, I think, very telling of the situation for the poor farm households, which are driven off the land and have really insufficient land for subsistence, while large multinationals control the best land. But there were also climate environmental factors. So I did publish a paper that showed how extreme events related to too much water, so intense rainfall and flooding, and also too little rainfall, droughts, were related to outmigration. And not surprisingly, those in the most vulnerable locations, for example, here on steep slopes, those next to riverbeds are more likely to flood, were more likely to be vulnerable and more likely, therefore, to be desperate and not have any other option but to migrate to the frontier. So we talked about internal migration and forest change. What about international migration's impact on the environment? So here, the impact is through remittances, money sent back from migrants in the destination to the origin areas, and also this indirect route of urbanization, globalization, and change in consumption that then impacts what is produced on the land. So this is work my former graduate student who was hired at the University of North Carolina in the Department of Geography, Jason Davis, and I did on migration and smallholder decision-making in Central America. We used data that was available from Princeton University, secondary data that we analyzed of thousands of households that were surveyed at the Mexican-US border from Central America. And we focused on the part of the questionnaire on what are the investments of the remittances? What are they investing their remittances in? And we tested how migration remittances alter smallholder farming practices. And we found that international migration correlates with an increase in land and pasture purchases, which we did not expect necessarily, because much of the literature had suggested that remittances go to child education, to investments in improving the home, for example. But here we found a clear signal of investing in increasing land purchases for pasture allocation, which has great implications for forest transitions as we showed in the satellite image, composite satellite image of the Lacandon, the great outsized impact of cattle on the forest. So the second pathway of international migration and how it impacts deforestation is through urbanization, globalization, and changing diets, and therefore what's produced in rural areas, including forest frontiers. So as I was alluding to earlier, this is an exciting time to study population and health dynamics in relation to the environment, because the world is now approximately, finally, 50% urban, but we have two worlds. And this is most egregiously observed in places like sub-Saharan Africa. But even in Latin America, we have places like the Southern Cone, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, which are 90% plus urban, and places like Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia, that still are close to 50% urban. And within these countries, there's vast variation. And I did a research project for the for WWF financed by USAID that showed really great variation within places like Guatemala, Ecuador, Bolivia, where we have places of very high fertility and mortality, and places in remote rural areas that look more like Africa, and then areas that are urbanized and look more like, say, North America. So these two worlds are associated with two distinct pathways of food production and consumption. Pathway one is the early transition stage, high population growth, rural to rural migration, low technology, low yields in the agricultural fields, still poverty, subsistence, and a clustering of deaths around infectious disease. And this, we already observed an example of this, the Lacandon National Park in Guatemala. And then there's this transition increasingly towards this second pathway, which is following population growth, urbanization. So people leaving the household farm and moving into the city, a transition that we went through a couple hundred years ago in the United States is unfolding right now in the developing world. And with this urbanization, we have an increase in wage labor, and with that, an increase in salary that enables increased meat consumption. And then what's left in the rural areas is land that's been consolidated among export producers with high yield, increased affluence, high technology invested in the agricultural fields. And with that, a shift from dying of diseases at infancy or close to infancy to deaths later in life related to obesity, degenerative diseases, cancer, and heart disease. Of course, with this change in diets towards more red meat, towards more packaged goods, pre-processed, high in sugars and fats and salts. So this research we did in Latin America, examining forest change during the first decade of the 21st century. We can see different areas of red hotspots of deforestation, and some places in green of reforestation. We first examined how rural population change would relate to forest cover change. And we looked at 1990 to 2000 in terms of rural population change in relation to forest cover change. We ran a regression, and in our regression, we found a R-squared of 0.000. No relation whatsoever between rural population change and forest cover change. So that made us wonder, why is that? We know that demographic transitions, and as I showed you in the example of the Lacandon, and not just in the Lacandon, there's other literature suggesting that population at local levels is related to forest cover change. So why at a continental scale do we not see this relationship? And when we parsed apart the different regions, we saw what's going on here that might suggest why we don't see a correlation between population and land change. So on the one hand, we have these areas of high deforestation, especially in Brazil. Here we have reforestation in northern Mexico and in northeast Brazil. And in terms of a climate signal, this is precisely what's happening in northern Mexico and in northeast Brazil. We have reforestation associated with, statistically, an increase in rainfall in these areas. And this is related to global climate change. And then we have these areas such as the Lacandon, the Maya Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala, and also here in Ecuador and Peru and the slopes of the Andes, this pathway one deforestation of poverty and smallholder colonists looking for land. But then we have this huge swath of deforestation in South America, Brazil, Paraguay, northern Argentina, related to what? Related to increased pig and poultry production. And with that, the exporting of soybeans to feed the pig and poultry production that is skyrocketed upwards, particularly in China. And we know that in China, this consumption has co-evolved with the rapid urbanization of over 100 million people, unprecedented in history, off of the farms into the mushrooming cities of China's eastern seaboard. So in this case, there is a population impact related to environmental change, but it's more distant in space and time. It's migration elsewhere, in this case, urbanization in China, for example, related to what's produced in another place. China cannot produce sufficient crops to feed their livestock, and so they have to export their agriculture where they can, such as in the Amazon rainforest. Okay, so we've discussed some links between population health and environment and land change. What about how climate change impacts human health? So this is work we did with graduate student Marta Jankowska and colleagues here at UCSB who are climatologists on climate change, health, and dynamics relative to food security, morbidity, and mortality. So here is a map of Mali, which is in the Sahel in sub-Saharan Africa. And we can see that northern Mali is largely arid and can sustain only pastoral livelihoods. By the time you're in the far southern corner in this dark green, you have rain-fed agriculture. But with climate change, we observe that the area in which rain-fed agriculture can produce crops has shifted southward. And with that, we have these clusters in black that are the Demographic and Health Survey clusters. And we see that there's much more population density, obviously, where rain-fed agriculture is possible in the south. We found that clusters location within PPET minus 100, and that's that number means nothing except that that's where the line between rain-fed agriculture is possible or not predicts severity for stunting and underweight, likely due to climate-driven livelihoods that fail to support cereal crops. The multi-level model isolates climate anomalies as independent predictors of thousands of infant deaths. The PPT contour, where rain-fed agriculture is possible, is demonstrably shifting southward due to drying and warming, enveloping more Malians in an expanding population. So you have increasing population in the numerator and decreasing land availability in the denominator, creating a population environment crunch for vulnerable children. This is work we did in sub-Saharan Africa, where we overlapped in red areas where population had increased between 1990 and 2010 by more than 50 people per kilometer squared, and in yellow, declining precipitation. And you can see that South-Saharan Africa is really suffering from this combination of trends. And then we looked at satellite data, which helped us understand browning in the area. So is it true that precipitation is causing desiccation of crops? And we found that yes, it is, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, and especially in the eastern portion of sub-Saharan Africa. And then we looked at percent increase in under 5 children between 2000 and 2015, based on AfriPop's demography data set at the continental scale, and how that relates to browning and rainfall. And we can see that the highly populated Lake Victoria region, which is here in inset, is subjected to recurrent droughts and flooding associated with increasing rainfall variability and associated detrimental effects of human health, especially malaria and diarrhea. So here we clearly see this convergence of climate change and impacts on health. Then we have a project in California on climate change and extreme heat exposure. In 2014, over 2,500 California workers experienced heat illness, and nearly 20 died from heat stroke and heat-related causes on the job. Heat-related deaths of agricultural workers are 20 times higher than the general workforce. As you can see, as air temperature increases, especially getting over 35 degrees centigrade, so think about 80, 85 degrees, then physical work capacity declines sharply. We can see here average summer air temperature across California is particularly hot in the Imperial and the Central Valleys, in the stars where we are doing our research in 3 cities in rural Fresno County: Huron, Avalinga, and Coalinga. Huron, Avenal, and Coalinga. They share a similar history with heavy Latinx population, a large transient labor force, low income communities, generally low environmental quality indicators. And we did data collection in December of 2020 and November, December, and now we're also going to do it November, December of 2022. And I'm probably going to have to pick up the pace here to make sure that we have enough time for questions. But I'll just summarize that we have about 1/10 of indigenous population. We have most of the people coming from Mexico, but also from other Central American locations. and we have a relatively low education level of the population. The take-home message here is that extreme heat has a negative impact on agricultural production, reducing output via labor efficiency 3 to 4%, depending on crop. COVID-19 adds socioeconomic negative impacts on vulnerable populations, such as farm workers, already impacted by climate extremes on two fronts, both the reduction on remittances and the loss of workdays. COVID-19 positive test rate exceeded that of reported numbers of 4 other geographical locations and ethnic groups. So these migrant populations working in the Central Valley really are hit by this dual burden of extreme heat and COVID-19. Now, shifting to Senegal, this is a project on leveraging nature to eliminate schistosomiasis. The main question is, can prawns, native prawns to the area, curb schistosomiasis transition? And can these prawns then also enhance diets and livelihoods for locals? If so, why and under what conditions? So for this project to succeed, it's really predicated on 2 questions. Will the prawns thrive, and will they delight in eating the snails that will then decrease the schistosomiasis transmission? And so we did work with Stanford, administering surveys in years 1 through 4. And at the same time, UCSB and Stanford ecologists introduced prawns in year 2 and measured their vitality and impact on the snails. And then we had Senegalese health partners measuring infection rates in local populations. So we have mixed results, and we have an article that is under review at Nature. So stay tuned for the final results. But I would say that more research is needed, but we do see some impact of positive impact of the introduction of native prawns on snail reduction, therefore schistosomiasis reduction and transmission. And as we published here in Close Neglected Tropical Diseases, exposure, hazard, and vulnerability, including exposure to climate change, all contributed to reinfection in the area of schistosomiasis. Okay, so how about population health and climate change? So this is work we published in PNAS, showing that improving rural healthcare reduces illegal logging and conserves carbon in a tropical forest. Tropical forest loss currently exceeds forest gain, leading to a net greenhouse gas emission that exacerbates global climate change. We evaluated 10-year impact of a human-centered solution to achieve natural climate mitigation through reductions in illegal logging in rural Borneo. Conservation, education, and alternative livelihood programs were also offered. We estimated that nearly 30 kilometers squared of deforestation was averted in the national park over a decade. Concurrently, the intervention provided healthcare access to more than 28,000 patients. We observed a dose response and forest change rate to intervention engagement across communities bordering the parks. The greatest logging reductions were adjacent to the most highly engaged villages. So results suggested that community-derived solutions simultaneously improved healthcare access for local and indigenous communities and sustainably conserved carbon stocks in a protected forest. So what are the data implications of all this? So first of all, I want to point out that, as you see, I present a work that both uses primary and secondary data, but I want you to think about how important primary data is. Secondary data will never replace primary data, which is often collected at local scales. Think about how the results might change if I had used demographic and health surveys to measure deforestation in the Sierra de Lacandon National Park, where different farmers use different measurements. They don't use hectares. So we have to translate that. If I don't have confidence that secondary data has taken these things into account, it's hard to trust it. Similarly, for dealing with very specific projects, such as, the question of whether reintroducing native prawns will reduce schistosomiasis transmission, there aren't surveys that probe these very targeted questions. And for these, and there are so many that are so important in the world that we have to research, we do need primary data collection. And humility and caution, therefore, is called for in interpreting results from secondary data. In terms of policy implications, when I was lead author for the 5th Global Environmental Outlook of the United Nations in preparation for the 2012 Rio World Summit, I was able to get past the gauntlet of many reviewers to basically scribe this take-home message, that for the developed world, we need to reduce through technological, behavioral, and other means red meat, water and energy consumption, and enhance GHG emission mitigation efforts. Whereas in the developing world, we need to support the Sustainable Development Goals, calling for education for all boys and girls and access to healthcare for all. They're moral imperatives unto themselves, and they also help the environment. Thank you. Gracias. Obrigado. Merci. E Jarjef.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I guess we should open the floor if anybody has any questions. You can just unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
Should I stop the share, or I guess I'll keep it in case people want to see one of the slides particularly? Any questions? Comments?
So I can ask one. So when you were speaking about those red areas on the map that was representing one family, you mentioned that most of those, the smaller ones, are not cattle farms. So do you also see any change when looking at cattle farming, whether that impacts fertility at all?
It's a great question. And we might hypothesize that with the de-intensification that is associated with the adoption of livestock, in other words, you don't need as many hands on the farm with livestock. It's not nearly as labor intensive, that we might see fertility reduction. We're doing a third wave of the surveys coming up in December, and we'll be able to look at exactly that question, because we have observed expansion of livestock in the park. And we have observed a decrease in fertility. I know this just from doing sort of unofficial fieldwork in the region over the last several years. But for measuring it formally, we'll be able to follow up on that question following surveys in December. It's a really good question. Mariam?
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I just had a quick question that relates to like the earlier part. So I apologize if I'm not like recalling the information correctly, but you mentioned something about the amount of land and the correlation between that and fertility rates, if I'm not mistaken. When you're making that kind of data judgment, are you like controlling for other factors to better understand like what is the correlation between amount of land and fertility? I wasn't able to fully like wrap my head around that data point.
Yeah, our regression model controls for a whole host of socioeconomic factors that really then do isolate fertility as a statistically significant factor.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question, because I mean, you can't assume just that you see a bivariate correlation that's causation. And even with a multivariate regression where we control for all the socioeconomic factors, we still don't claim that it's causation, but it is statistically significant even when controlling for other factors. Yeah, Adrian?
Hi, thanks again for being here today. I am just curious more broadly, what makes fertility a good metric to use in the research that you're doing? I've seen it definitely used in a lot of, it's kind of like a measure of like the health capacity of a region. Just wondering, like, why was it selected?
Why was the region selected?
Sorry, why was fertility as a metric?
Oh yeah, I mean, because of interest, I did my PhD at the University of North Carolina, where I was a graduate student fellow at the Carolina Population Center. And I was working on a team that was doing this work in the Ecuadorian Amazon that had interest in population and population environment dynamics. So most of the work was actually on land change, deforestation, but one small component of it involved fertility.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
There's also a question in the chat that asks, could you describe the relationship between your field of work and current political movements to push against climate change?
Sure. I mean, I think, my concluding slide kind of gets at this, where, we have these two different pathways in the world right now, and the developing world. And there's this supposedly inexorable transition from pathway 1 to pathway 2. So from rural poverty to then urban, urban wage laborers. So then the impact being rural, local in time and space, to then urban, more distant in time and space, more through consumption rather than through production. And as populations transition through the demographic and economic transitions, we need to really think seriously about how much can we consume, and how can we consume, and how can we produce what we're consuming. And one major issue is the consumption of animal protein, which in order to produce requires the use of most of the Earth's arable land. So less than 1% of the Earth's surface is in urbanized areas, and the rest of the Earth's surface that is occupied by humans is nearly all of it is in agriculture, most of it in either livestock or in crops to feed livestock. So if we did change our diets, and I think one might argue we're going to need to, in order to absorb a growing middle class from the developing world, we would really have a massive impact on literally the face of the earth, and release pressures on forests globally.
Dr. Lopez-Carr, I'm just wondering if there's also an impact in terms of livestock production on energy use and water use. Is there any kind of correlation between those? Like if, reducing red meat consumption, for example, would be a sort of panacea that would help with reducing water and energy use as well, or not necessarily?
It's outside of my research expertise, but I would say that that livestock, particularly cattle, are very water intensive. And so, we are diverting water potentially, to the extent that we have irrigation, that could be used elsewhere. And thinking about South America and the increase in livestock there, impacts on the forest and in soybeans, and how we have cities like Sao Paulo, which almost ran out of water a few years ago. These are definitely important questions to ask. In terms of energy, I'm not sure that the impact would be direct, except to say that with the release of land, of just the vast majority of arable land on the face of the earth, that would be associated with a decrease or even an elimination of meat consumption, we would have all this area of land that we could dedicate to renewable energy production, whether it be solar or wind or what have you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, Sarah? I think you're muted, Sarah.
You're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Oh.
Could you type it in the chat, Sarah? Would that work, or is it too complicated?
Thoughts on lab-grown meat? I think it's an interesting potential solution. And to the extent that it's like the solution or one of the solutions, it's hard to say. It's hard to say what the magnitude of, lab-grown meat will be on resolving or helping to resolve the impact of human meat consumption on natural resources. There has been a rapid growth in the adoption of consuming vegetarian-based meat. And I think that is, that then, suggests that people might be amenable to lab-grown meat as well. But it seems like it's very early in the process to be able to make any definitive statements about that. But I think it's an interesting process that's evolving. Any other questions or comments?
I think that might be a good time to wrap up now. But thank you so much for coming, Dr. Lopez-Carr. It was such an interesting presentation. And yeah, thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Please feel free to follow up if you have any additional comments or questions, or just want to follow up.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.